There are some doors in life that should never be opened, because once you see what's behind them, you can never return to who you were before. On the night meant to mark the beginning of forever, a bride followed a sound that did not belong. And what she discovered involved the two people she trusted most. This is not a story about passion. It is a story about betrayal, blood ties, and a truth that shattered a family from the inside. Stay with me till the end, because the final revelation changes everything. Why was her groom missing on their wedding night? Why was her niece nowhere to be found? And why did the silence behind that door feel louder than any scream? What the bride saw was never spoken aloud, but it was understood by everyone who stood there afterward. This story comes from a real account shared anonymously online, a confession that sparked thousands of responses from people who recognized the patterns, the silence, the way families protect secrets at the cost of the innocent. Her name, for this story, is Margaret. She was 32 when she married. Not young by the standards of her small Michigan town, but not old either, just patient. Margaret had spent her 20s building a career as a school counselor, caring for her aging mother, and watching her younger siblings start families of their own. She was known as the steady one, the peacemaker, the woman who could defuse any argument at Thanksgiving dinner with a well-timed joke or a plate of her famous apple pie. She never rushed into love because she believed it should be right, not just convenient. When she met Daniel, it felt like the universe had finally rewarded her patience. He was 35, a contractor who'd moved to town 2 years earlier to help rebuild after a series of storms had torn through the county. He had kind eyes, a strong handshake, and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Margaret's family adored him almost immediately. Her father, a retired firefighter with a skeptical nature, clapped Daniel on the back after their second meeting and said he's good people. Her mother cried happy tears when Daniel asked for Margaret's hand in the living room where Margaret had grown up, surrounded by family photos and the smell of her mother's lavender sachets. The engagement lasted 8 months, long enough for Daniel to become woven into the fabric of Margaret's family. He showed up to her nephew's baseball games, helped her brother-in-law install a new deck, and spent Sunday afternoons at her parents' house watching football and eating her mother's cooking. He was respectful, hard-working, and by all accounts, deeply in love with Margaret. At the rehearsal dinner, Margaret's father stood up and said with genuine emotion that he wasn't losing a daughter, but gaining the son he'd always wanted. Margaret remembers looking at Daniel across the table that night, his face lit by candlelight, and thinking this is what home feels like. But there was someone else in Margaret's life who seemed equally taken with Daniel. Her niece, Emily, was 16, the daughter of Margaret's older sister, Karen. Emily had always been a bright, bubbly girl, the kind who volunteered at animal shelters and wrote poetry in spiral notebooks covered with stickers. But over the past year, something had shifted. Emily had become quieter, more withdrawn. She spent hours alone in her room, and when she did emerge, there was a heaviness in her eyes that Margaret noticed but didn't fully understand. Karen chalked it up to typical teenage moodiness, the stress of high school and friend drama. Margaret had gently suggested that Emily might benefit from talking to someone, a counselor perhaps, but Karen had waved it off. She's fine, just going through a phase. What Margaret didn't know, what no one in the family seemed to see, was that Emily had developed what appeared to be an unusual attachment to Daniel. She found excuses to be around him, volunteered to help him with projects, laughed a little too hard at his jokes. At first, Margaret found it endearing. She thought Emily was just enjoying having a fun, younger male figure in the family, someone who wasn't her own father with all that complicated history. Margaret's brother-in-law, Emily's father, had left when Emily was 12, and the divorce had been bitter and public. Margaret thought maybe Emily was drawn to Daniel's steadiness, his presence. It seemed innocent. It seemed harmless. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late September, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air carried that crisp promise of autumn. The ceremony was held at a small chapel on the edge of town, the same chapel where Margaret's parents had married 40 years earlier. Margaret wore her grandmother's veil and carried white roses mixed with wildflowers from her mother's garden. When she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she saw Daniel waiting for her at the altar, and for a moment, everything else fell away. This was the moment she'd been patient for. This was the beginning of forever. The reception was held at the family farm, a property that had been in Margaret's family for 3 generations. White tents stretched across the lawn, strings of lights crisscrossed overhead, and tables were laden with home-cooked food prepared by aunts, cousins, and family friends. There was dancing, toasts that went on too long, and laughter that echoed across the fields. Margaret's youngest nephew caught the garter, and her best friend from college caught the bouquet. Daniel spun Margaret around the dance floor to their song, a slow ballad about finding your way home, and Margaret felt, perhaps for the first time in years, completely at peace. Emily was there, of course, wearing a pale blue bridesmaid dress that made her look older than 16. She smiled for photos, hugged Margaret, and told her aunt she looked beautiful. But Margaret noticed something off in Emily's demeanor. The girl kept glancing toward Daniel, and when she thought no one was looking, her smile would fade into something that looked almost like longing. Margaret pushed the thought away. She was being paranoid. This was her wedding day. Everything was perfect. As the night wore on and guests began to leave, Margaret and Daniel said their goodbyes and retreated to the farmhouse's guest wing, a renovated section that Margaret's parents had offered for their wedding night. It wasn't a honeymoon suite at some fancy hotel, but it was private, comfortable, and filled with the kind of warmth that only a family home can provide. The plan was simple: spend the night here, sleep in, and then drive to the airport the next afternoon for a week in the Caribbean. Margaret changed out of her wedding dress and into a silk nightgown her mother had given her, something old-fashioned and romantic. She felt nervous, giddy, the way you're supposed to feel on your wedding night. Daniel seemed distracted. He kept checking his phone, which Margaret thought was odd but didn't comment on. Maybe he was checking flight details or messages from his groomsmen. He kissed her forehead and said he needed to step out for a moment, just to grab something from his car. Margaret said okay, settled onto the bed with a glass of champagne her maid of honor had left behind, and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Margaret tried calling his phone. It rang, but he didn't answer. She texted, "Where are you?" No response. 30 minutes turned into 45. The champagne went flat. Margaret felt the first flutter of worry in her chest, the kind that starts small but grows exponentially when left unattended. She got up, pulled a robe over her nightgown, and stepped into the hallway. The farmhouse was quiet now. Most of the family had gone home or were staying in the main house on the other side of the property. The guest wing felt too silent, too still. Margaret walked down the corridor, past family photos on the walls, past the guest bathroom with its floral wallpaper, toward the back staircase that led to the old storage rooms her parents rarely used anymore. That's when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly, but the absence of sound in a way that felt wrong. A heaviness in the air. She stopped at the top of the stairs and listened. Nothing. But her instincts, the same ones she'd honed through years of working with troubled teenagers, told her something was off. She descended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the wooden banister. At the bottom was a narrow hallway with 3 doors. 2 were open, revealing empty rooms filled with boxes and old furniture. The 3rd door, at the very end, was closed. Margaret stood in front of that closed door for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the cold wood floor beneath her bare feet. There was no sound coming from behind the door, but there was a presence, a sense that someone, or multiple someones, were on the other side. She reached for the doorknob. It turned easily. The door swung inward. The room was dim, lit only by moonlight filtering through a small window. It took Margaret's eyes a moment to adjust, and in that moment, her brain tried to make sense of what she was seeing. There was a couch, an old one her parents had moved down here years ago, and on that couch were 2 people, Daniel and Emily. They weren't speaking. They weren't moving. But the way they were positioned, the state of their clothing, the look of frozen panic on both their faces when they saw Margaret standing in the doorway, told her everything she needed to know. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't say a single word. She just stood there, her hand still on the doorknob, and felt something inside her chest crack open. Not her heart, exactly. Something deeper. The foundation upon which she'd built her understanding of who she was, who her family was, what safety meant. Emily started to cry, a horrible, choked sound. Daniel stood up, tried to speak, but Margaret held up her hand. The gesture was so calm, so controlled, that it silenced him immediately. She looked at Emily, really looked at her, and saw in the girl's face not seduction or manipulation, but confusion, shame, and something that looked terrifyingly like relief that it was finally over. Margaret turned and walked out. She didn't run. She didn't slam the door. She simply left, walking back up the stairs, down the hallway, and into the room that was supposed to be her wedding night sanctuary. She sat on the edge of the bed in her silk nightgown and robe, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for. An explanation. An apology. The world to make sense again. None of those things came. Daniel appeared in the doorway maybe 10 minutes later. His shirt was buttoned wrong. His face was pale. He started to say her name, but Margaret cut him off with a single question, delivered in a voice so calm it was almost eerie. How long? Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, and then, perhaps realizing that lies would only make this worse, told her the truth. 3 months. It started 3 months ago. Margaret did the math in her head. 3 months ago was the beginning of summer, right after Emily's school year ended, when she'd started spending more time at Margaret's parents' house helping with wedding preparations. Margaret asked another question. Does anyone else know? Daniel shook his head. Margaret nodded, still eerily calm, and told him to leave. Not just the room. The property. The town. Her life. Daniel tried to argue, tried to explain, tried to say it wasn't what she thought. But Margaret stood up, and the look in her eyes must have communicated something final because he stopped talking, grabbed his jacket, and left. Margaret heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway, heard the front door open and close, heard his car start in the driveway below. And then, only then, did she allow herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat on the bed until dawn began to lighten the sky, her mind cycling through memories, reinterpreting every interaction, every moment she'd dismissed as innocent. The way Emily had volunteered to help Daniel with the wedding arch. The way he'd offered to drive Emily home from Margaret's house on nights when Karen was working late. The private jokes Margaret had noticed but not questioned. All of it took on a new, sickening context. When the sun finally rose, Margaret called her sister. Karen answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. Margaret said 4 words. We need to talk. Karen must have heard something in her tone because she agreed immediately to come over. Margaret then called her parents, asked them to come to the farmhouse. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. They heard it in her voice. Within an hour, they were all gathered in the farmhouse living room. Margaret's parents, her sister Karen, and Emily, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floorboards. Margaret's mother kept asking what happened. Where's Daniel? Is everything all right? Margaret ignored the questions and looked directly at Emily. Tell them, she said quietly. Emily burst into tears. Through sobs, the story came out. How Daniel had started paying special attention to her. How he'd told her she was mature for her age, that she understood him in ways Margaret didn't. How it had progressed slowly, a touch here, a compliment there, until the lines had blurred completely. Karen's face went through a series of transformations as she listened. Confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally, a rage so profound that Margaret's father had to physically restrain her from going after Daniel. Margaret's mother sat frozen, her hand over her mouth. But what struck Margaret most was Emily's demeanor. The girl wasn't defiant. She wasn't proud. She looked terrified and ashamed, but also, underneath it all, there was a kind of exhausted relief. This secret had been eating her alive. The family's initial reaction was exactly what Margaret had feared. Her father wanted to call the police immediately. Karen wanted to hunt Daniel down. But her mother, ever the protector of the family's image, said something that made Margaret's blood run cold. We need to think about this carefully. What will people say? Emily's reputation. The scandal. Margaret realized in that moment that her mother was more concerned about appearances than about what had actually happened. That's when Margaret understood the fight wasn't just against Daniel's betrayal, but against a system of silence that protected perpetrators at the expense of victims. Margaret made a decision right there. She told her family that she was getting the marriage annulled, that Daniel would not be welcome at any family gathering ever again, and that Emily needed professional help, not judgment. Karen, still shaking with anger, agreed immediately. Emily needed to talk to a therapist who specialized in trauma and manipulation. This wasn't a teenage mistake. This was an adult man in a position of trust who had exploited a vulnerable child. Because that's what Emily was. A child. The next weeks were a blur of painful conversations and difficult decisions. Margaret filed for an annulment, citing fraud and the fact that the marriage had never been consummated. Daniel didn't contest it. He'd left town within days of the wedding night, moved back to whatever place he'd come from before arriving in their community 2 years earlier. Margaret heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd told people the marriage just didn't work out, conveniently leaving out the why. She didn't bother correcting the record publicly. She had no interest in making this a town spectacle. Emily started therapy. The therapist confirmed what Margaret had suspected. Emily had been groomed. The process had been textbook, starting with special attention and compliments, escalating to private conversations where Daniel had positioned himself as the only one who truly understood her, and culminating in a physical relationship that Emily had been manipulated into believing was her choice. Emily hadn't understood she was being victimized until she saw Margaret's face in that doorway and realized, perhaps for the first time, how wrong everything had been. About 6 weeks after the wedding night, Margaret received a phone call that changed her understanding of the situation entirely. It was from a woman named Rachel, someone Margaret had never met. Rachel explained that she'd heard about what happened through a friend of a friend, the way news travels in small communities even when you try to keep it quiet. Rachel said she needed to tell Margaret something important, something she wished she'd had the courage to say earlier. Rachel had been engaged to Daniel 4 years ago, in a different town about 2 hours away. They'd been together for a year, and everything had seemed perfect until Rachel's teenage cousin came to stay with them for a summer. The cousin was 15. By the end of that summer, Rachel had discovered Daniel in a compromising situation with the girl. When confronted, Daniel had blamed the teenager, called her a seductress, and convinced Rachel's family that it was the girl who had pursued him. Rachel had believed him, or wanted to believe him, and they'd sent the cousin back home. But the guilt had eaten at Rachel, and 3 months later, she'd called off the engagement and cut all ties with Daniel. Rachel had never reported him. She'd never warned anyone. She'd been too ashamed, too confused about what she'd seen and who to believe. But when she heard through the grapevine that Daniel had done something similar on his wedding night to his new wife's niece, Rachel knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. She told Margaret there was a pattern, that she suspected there might be others. That Daniel was skilled at finding vulnerable young girls, gaining access to them through relationships with their families, and exploiting them while maintaining a perfect facade. Margaret listened to Rachel's story with a growing sense of horror, not just at Daniel's actions, but at how many people had known or suspected something and said nothing. How many opportunities there had been to stop him. Rachel apologized over and over, said she should have spoken up, should have warned someone, anyone. Margaret told her gently that this wasn't Rachel's fault, that the responsibility lay with Daniel, and with a culture that made victims and witnesses feel like speaking up would cause more harm than staying quiet. After talking to Rachel, Margaret made another decision. She went to the police. She filed a report detailing what had happened between Daniel and Emily. The detective she spoke with was kind but realistic. Emily was 16, which was above the age of consent in their state. Without evidence of force or coercion, and with the relationship having appeared consensual on the surface, there wasn't much they could do criminally. The detective did note Daniel's name in the system, creating a record that would be there if anyone else ever came forward. Margaret understood the limitations of the legal system, but she wanted that record to exist. She wanted someone, somewhere, to be watching. The twist that Margaret didn't see coming was her own family's reaction to her going to the police. Her mother was furious, said Margaret was making things worse, that Emily would be traumatized by having to potentially testify or have her name in police records. Margaret's father supported her, but quietly, careful not to openly defy his wife. Even Karen was ambivalent, torn between wanting justice for her daughter and wanting to protect Emily from further pain. Margaret found herself isolated, the one family member willing to say out loud that what happened was wrong and that Daniel needed to be held accountable, even if that accountability was imperfect. Margaret moved out of her hometown 3 months after the wedding that never was. She took a job at a school in a city 2 hours away, far enough to start fresh but close enough to visit family when needed. The decision wasn't easy. She loved her parents, her siblings, her nieces, and nephews. But she couldn't stay in a place where her wedding photos were still in other people's homes, where she might run into someone who'd ask innocently about her husband, where the weight of what had happened pressed down on her every time she drove past the chapel or the farmhouse. Before she left, Margaret did something important. She sat down with Emily one last time. Emily was doing better by then. The therapy was helping. She was back in school, had rejoined her poetry club, and was slowly rebuilding her sense of self. Margaret told Emily that none of this was her fault, that she'd been manipulated by an adult who knew exactly what he was doing, that Margaret didn't blame her, would never blame her, and that Emily's worth wasn't defined by what had happened to her. Emily cried and told Margaret she was sorry, so sorry for ruining everything. Margaret held her niece's hands and said firmly that Emily hadn't ruined anything. Daniel had. The people who stayed silent had. The culture that taught girls to be flattered by adult men's attention had. But Emily, who'd been a child trying to navigate a situation engineered by someone with far more power, bore no responsibility for the destruction. Margaret told Emily that she hoped one day the girl would see that truth for herself. The conversation Margaret had with her mother before leaving was harder. Her mother still didn't understand why Margaret had to go, why she couldn't just move on and find someone else and let the past stay in the past. Margaret tried to explain that it wasn't about holding grudges. It was about recognizing that the family's first instinct had been to protect their reputation rather than Emily's well-being, and Margaret couldn't unsee that. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine when the foundations of trust had crumbled. Her mother said something then that Margaret thinks about often. She said, "You were always too sensitive, too intense. You never learned to just let things go." Margaret responded, "I learned to pay attention. And that's not a flaw, Mom. That's how we stop these things from happening again." They didn't part on bad terms, exactly, but there was an understanding that their relationship had fundamentally changed. Margaret was no longer the peacemaker who smoothed over conflicts. She was the one willing to name them, even when it was uncomfortable. In her new city, Margaret started over in the quietest ways. She rented a small apartment with hardwood floors and big windows. She adopted a rescue dog, a terrier mix with anxiety issues that matched her own. She threw herself into her work, advocating fiercely for the students who came to her office with stories of manipulation, abuse, and betrayal by people they should have been able to trust. She became known among her colleagues as someone who listened without judgment, but also without accepting easy explanations that let perpetrators off the hook. Margaret also started speaking up in ways she never had before. When friends made jokes about teenage girls being flirtatious or dramatic, Margaret would quietly but firmly explain why that narrative was dangerous. When family members at holiday gatherings suggested that some secrets were better kept quiet, Margaret would push back, asking who that silence was protecting and who it was harming. She wasn't preachy about it. She didn't lecture. But she refused to participate in the kind of collective amnesia that had allowed Daniel to move through life unchecked. About a year after leaving, Margaret got another call. This time it was from a detective in a town 3 states away. They'd arrested Daniel. A 15-year-old girl's parents had found concerning messages on their daughter's phone, messages that escalated from friendly to inappropriate to explicitly sexual. When they'd confronted Daniel, he'd fled, but not before the parents had called the police. During the investigation, Daniel's name had been run through various databases, and Margaret's police report had come up. The detective wanted to know if Margaret would be willing to provide a statement about the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed. Margaret said yes without hesitation. Her statement, combined with Rachel's and testimonies from 2 other women who came forward after Daniel's arrest made the news, helped build a case that Daniel had a clear pattern of targeting underage girls through relationships with their families. He was ultimately convicted on multiple counts related to the most recent case and sentenced to 15 years in prison. It wasn't justice for Emily, whose case had fallen outside the statute of limitations and legal definitions. But it was something. It was an end to his ability to hurt anyone else, at least for a significant period of time. 3 years after her wedding night, Margaret went on a date. It was nothing dramatic, just coffee with a teacher from a neighboring school who'd been asking her out for months before she finally agreed. His name was Thomas, and he was kind, patient, and refreshingly straightforward. When Margaret told him, on their 3rd date, a condensed version of what had happened with Daniel, Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix anything. He just said, "That must have been incredibly painful, and I'm glad you're here now." Margaret didn't know if Thomas would be the person she built a future with, but she appreciated his presence, his steadiness, the fact that he understood that her past was part of who she was but didn't define her entire story. She was learning, slowly, that trust could be rebuilt. Not naively, not blindly, but with eyes wide open and boundaries firmly in place. Emily graduated high school and went to college, studying psychology with the goal of eventually working with trauma survivors. She and Margaret talked regularly, their relationship having evolved into something deeper than aunt and niece. They were survivors of the same man's manipulation, bound by an understanding that didn't require many words. Emily told Margaret once that seeing her aunt walk away from Daniel, refuse to accept the family's pressure to stay quiet, and then rebuild her life, had given Emily a template for her own healing. If you could do it, Emily said, then I knew I could too. Margaret's relationship with her family slowly improved, though it would never return to what it had been. Her father apologized for not standing up more forcefully in those early days. Her mother never quite got there, but she did start listening more carefully when Margaret talked about her work with students. Karen and Margaret grew closer, bonded by their shared determination to protect Emily and other young people from predators who hid behind charming smiles and family connections. The farmhouse where Margaret's wedding reception had been held was eventually sold. Her parents downsized to a smaller property, and while the official reason was retirement and easier maintenance, Margaret suspected they also wanted distance from the memories that house contained. The new owners renovated extensively, tearing out walls and updating everything. Margaret was glad. Let that building become something new, hold someone else's happy memories, exist free from the weight of that night. Margaret never remarried, though she came close once with Thomas, who remained a steady presence in her life for several years before they amicably parted ways, recognizing they wanted different things long-term. She was content with her life, her work, her dog, her small circle of trusted friends, her advocacy for students who needed someone to believe them. She'd learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating the painful parts of your story into a larger narrative where you're not defined by what was done to you, but by how you responded. There's an old saying that trust arrives on foot, but leaves on horseback. Margaret learned the truth of that in a single moment, standing in a doorway on what should have been the happiest night of her life. But she also learned something else. That betrayal, as devastating as it is, doesn't have to be the end of your story. That speaking uncomfortable truths is often the most loving thing you can do, even when it fractures relationships. That healing is possible, not in spite of the pain, but through it. What would you have done in Margaret's place? Would you have walked away that night, or tried to salvage the marriage? Would you have gone to the police knowing the legal system might not provide justice? Would you have been able to maintain a relationship with Emily, or would the pain have been too great? These aren't simple questions, and there are no perfect answers. Life rarely offers us clear villains and heroes, just complicated people making difficult choices in impossible situations. And what about Emily? How would you have felt if you were 16, manipulated by an adult you trusted, and then had your entire family's foundation crumble because of choices that weren't really yours? How do you rebuild a sense of self when the person who violated your trust was welcomed into your home, celebrated by your family, and given every opportunity to hurt you? The truth is, stories like Margaret and Emily's happen more often than we want to acknowledge. They happen in families that look perfect from the outside. They happen in communities where everyone knows everyone else. They happen because we've built systems that prioritize reputation over protection, silence over safety, and keeping the peace over speaking the truth. And they continue happening until enough people decide that discomfort is a price worth paying to keep children safe. Margaret's story didn't end with that terrible discovery on her wedding night. It began there. It began the moment she chose to open her eyes fully to what she'd seen, to refuse the comfortable fiction that would have let everyone pretend it never happened, and to walk forward into an uncertain future rather than stay in a poisoned past. That choice cost her the life she'd planned, but it gave her something more valuable, the ability to look at herself in the mirror every morning and know that she'd chosen truth, even when truth was agonizing. Before you go, we want to hear from you. Comment below and tell us, how did this story make you feel? What would you have done differently? And if you know someone who needs to hear Margaret's story, someone who's struggling with whether to speak up about betrayal or abuse in their own family, share this video with them. Sometimes we need to hear about someone else's courage before we can find our own. And if this is your first time here, click that subscribe button. We tell stories like this because they matter, because the wisdom hidden in human experience, even the painful parts, can light the way forward for someone else. We'd be honored to have you join us for the next one. Thank you for staying till the end. Your willingness to sit with difficult truths matters more than you know.